Red Dead Redemption 2 is everything a game just shouldn't be. For someone like me who loves the Souls games or games that push gameplay over story, the Rockstar title places its priorities on things that make me give up on other games. But where I roll my eyes at them, this cowboy adventure manages to still have something going for me. Hi, my name is Christian, and this is Rantable. This is your spoiler warning. We are talking a lot about Red Dead Redemption 2. Everything is on the table, but we'll get to Red Dead in a minute. Gaming fell off, games don't hit anymore. Whatever variation of this phrase you may hear, it seems a bit inescapable these days. Now, more than ever, there is more content releasing than anybody can physically get to experience in their lifetime. And in games specifically, it feels like there's this need to always have a take, always be part of the zeitgeist, and that inevitably affects how we look at games. Games only get 1 or 2 weeks before it's time to move on to the next one. That's not only a disservice to the art and years it took for the artists to make it, but also our relationship with it. To be mindful of this, I try to reflect a lot on my gaming habits in my own life. What interests me, what trailers catch my eye at big, sparkly events, what I actually end up picking up in a given year, what I finish, and when I decide to spend time on something older. Over the past few years, though, my tastes and interests in the medium have changed significantly. There was a time late in middle school where I was influenced out of liking Nintendo and decided to pick up an Xbox 360 and eventually a PS3, where I felt the pinnacle of gaming was Uncharted, The Last of Us, Batman Arkham, and other cinematic story-forward games. Gaming growing up to this day was and is my favorite hobby. And games like this at the time were all I wanted to play, because it seemed like nothing else was worth it if it wasn't chasing the highs of cinema, a medium I knew was reputable, respected, and worth the time of somebody more mature. I was 15, and that sentiment lasted a good long while. This focus changed drastically around 2020, when a lot of things changed. Today, whenever I sit down to play a game, I find myself settling on something more mechanical. As a working adult, my game time and relationship with games has changed. I prefer to focus on something that feels worthwhile at the end of the day. And when I say mechanical, I don't mean something where I can turn my brain off, but rather something where I have to be much more engaged in my own interpretation of what I'm experiencing. Games where they focus on obtuse systems, intricate tasks, combat as a big one, or problem solving. Even if a game I'm playing and enjoying or want to play has a story, I find myself resonating with ones that use the medium in a way that I couldn't experience by watching it on TV or a movie screen. At the beginning of this year, a bulk of my playtime was spent on things like replaying and getting the platinum in Death Stranding. Navigating a post-apocalyptic America by balancing packages in a modular control scheme was calming, engaging, and worked to serve the story of connection. Another more recent one has been replaying Elden Ring, and I don't think I need to tell you why that is engaging or would work for someone like me. If you were to ask me today what I think makes a game great, my answer will always start with vibes. But I think how a game challenges the player through its systems, whether that be combat, interactivity, puzzles, or how a game asks you to control it, is the answer I'd give more than if it's cinematic, large enough, long enough, or pretty enough to be worth my time and money. I still have a great love for the Uncharted series or Batman Arkham, and replay both of those regularly. But games like those have largely gone extinct. Even something like Uncharted 4, a really good game, it just can't be a tight 10 hours anymore. Most story-centric, cinematic action games have seemed to need to justify their existence over the last few years by ballooning to have these massive runtimes, and have lost the appeal they once had, at least for me. Either that, or they're now just open-world games with RPG elements and a largely lifeless world that exists to make you spend more time engaging with it to get to its next cutscene. Mimicking cinematic techniques works very well when the work is closer to the length of a miniseries, not 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours. Red Dead Redemption 2, by that metric, is everything a game shouldn't be, in my eyes. Its combat is a topic of criticism by many for its simplicity. The game puts a heavy focus on its cinematic narrative. It is indulgent in its scope. It's incredibly long and has a massive open world. It's the antithesis of where games should be headed to me. But somehow, it's consistently one of my favorite games of all time. I love it. To put a name on what I look for in games these days, I think it would be friction. We've largely reached a point where, in an effort to sell as many copies as possible, high-risk, big-budget games don't want players to face much resistance at all. As said earlier, there is just an absurd amount of content, so if any resistance or pushback annoys a player in the slightest, they can drop the game for something else and likely never look back. I've grown to appreciate friction a lot, as big games have sanded down nearly every edge they have for the sake of recouping the cost the game took to make. And that cost is just increasing every year in every console generation. As a concept in games, the conversation around friction manifests in a pretty toxic way. I think the most common examples of this conversation can be found in Twitter debates about the difficulty of Souls-likes and the topic of yellow paint. If you aren't familiar with either, the TLDR is people think Souls-likes need to be difficult or they should be easier. But changing anything at all ruins the game, and if changing the difficulty ruins the game isn't good to begin with. The yellow paint thing boils down to just not liking when games obviously direct players where to go, or not respecting the player's intelligence. Both of these conversations miss the forest for the trees, because difficulty in combat or being signaled what ledges can be mounted, these aren't the end-all be-all ways to implement friction in games. These design choices are an aspect of how games do or don't push back against players, but they exist as a byproduct of a greater vision on how we interact with games. The Souls series, for instance, is just flat-out obtuse all around by design. It's not that combat is so hard that you need to bash your head against the wall until what you're doing finally works. You can, but the game exists in a way where the answer to your combat-based problem is just not evident from the jump. Whether you want to figure out how to stomp a boss by trial and error, investigating the world through item descriptions, or relying on other players through conversation via in-game notes or online message boards, the game asks the player to find a solution, rather than be explicitly told one the second they are met with any resistance. So in this instance, friction is withholding information from the player. Big picture, I think the yellow paint example is driving toward the same point of providing or withholding information. The context of which this telegraphing happens is what's a bit more hit or miss for me though. It's one thing in a linear game to be directed on what you can engage with from bright markers, but in an open world, a path laid out in front of me to show how to get a secret or venture off the beaten path, it makes me less likely to want to even explore the open world. At that point, I'm far more likely to get annoyed when I start to realize how cumbersome it may feel to get from point A to B, when the path is laid out and the time to get there feels like padding. And that's where fast travel comes in. But listen, I just don't like to fast travel in open worlds. I'm usually worried I might miss something emergent because that's supposed to be one of the genre's appeals. But 9 times out of 10, open worlds with signposting and yellow paint don't have anything worthwhile, and not fast traveling just makes that more evident. Games like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring that have minimal signposting or yellow paint actually make me want to explore, because I don't know what's out there, and every time I play, I'm surprised by something. From an enemy placement, discovering a new enemy, to a shortcut or treasure I discovered and had to work to find. Sometimes it's nothing, and even that feels satisfying in this context, because I at least figured it out. Personally, I really like this kind of information-based friction. Whether it's a combat system with hidden weaknesses or resistances, or a map that just drops me in to figure it out, it inspires a curiosity in the player and incentivizes experimenting. That in itself spawns stories that are exclusive to my time with the game. How I choose to problem solve, how I discovered the solution. We can and likely will all reach the same conclusion, but how we get there and figure it out can differ. That's something only games can provide in this interactive context. A lot of games that are comparable to Red Dead Redemption 2 lack this kind of friction. Narrative-heavy games like The Last of Us or Hellblade both have relatively simple combat systems and signpost where to go and what to do. There's nothing wrong with that, and being linear, I think it mostly works, but this is the type of game I'm talking about, finding myself growing disinterested in these last few years. If the games I'm looking for are like a roller coaster or an interactive exhibit, these are more like a dark ride. On rails, fun to look at, impressive craftsmanship, and absolutely holding a place in a theme park. But with so many starting and stopping points to watch a cutscene, then follow a path to another, I start to question if this is what I want to spend my time with in this interactive medium. The friction in games like The Last of Us, to me, seems to come down to the themes they tackle. Challenging your audience with subject matter or theming is an admirable thing to focus on, but at that point, my focus shifts from how do I feel about this as a game and my relationship with it as I play and interact with it, to is this well written? I just don't have the patience for that when I know a film or TV show can probably tackle the same thing in similar fashion in a tenth of the time, probably more effectively. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 features a lot of these cutscenes that work to propel you forward in the narrative, so you would probably expect that to be a detractor for me here. But they're integrated into the world and how you interact with it seamlessly, where these others just aren't. When walking past an NPC in camp, if you even choose to be at camp, and they're marked to bring you on your next main mission, they just start talking to you. It feels like an emergent element of this open world, even though it's not. It is very scripted. And it is immersive because if Lenny wants Arthur's help, of course he'll stop him when he sees him. Red Dead Redemption 2's friction has a different focus than its cinematic and narrative contemporaries, as we've been talking about. Even though about a fifth of its time to complete is spent on cinematic cutscenes, the themes or subject matter in the narrative is not the main element challenging the player, like a lot of these others decide to settle with. The friction of Red Dead Redemption 2 is almost purely mechanical and control-oriented. Arthur Morgan is a hulking man navigating the Wild West in its dying days. He's weighty, tired, and you feel it. Rockstar games in the past have received criticism for how their characters feel clunky, but in Red Dead 2, it feels more deliberate than ever. Red Dead Redemption 2 is maybe the only example of a period piece in gaming. It's at least the only one I'm familiar with, especially on this scale. In film, a period piece is pretty much any historical story where production design and occasionally filming technique are fully committed to replicating and bringing to life a bygone era. Occasionally, this commitment can alienate an audience, which can be scary for a corporation that wants the biggest pool of purchasers possible. And we saw this happen on some level with Red Dead. Rockstar chose to embrace this philosophy with Red Dead Redemption 2, and it shows. In almost every facet of this project, the game is entirely dedicated to the slower, modular time period of the American West. In a lot of ways, the game feels like an immersive sim to me. I don't have much experience within that genre, but from what I can gather, it typically means a game has its own logic system that is sort of central to everything from story to how a player moves and interacts with objects in the environment. At the heart of Red Dead Redemption 2 is the core system. The entire crux of this game working for me, where other indulgent cinematic or open world AAA games falter, is the core system and what it does to tie the whole work together. This, I think, is where a lot of folks also become divided on the game, especially those who loved the original Red Dead Redemption and don't really care for Red Dead 2. John never had to deal with cores in his game. Everything felt more arcadey and a bit faster paced. Arthur, on the other hand, from the jump, has to deal with his overall health and stamina, which, if not fully maintained, can only make playing the game feel worse. On paper, this is nothing but harmful for getting as many players as possible on board, because as established, if they get annoyed, they'll drop the game like a hot rock for any other open world where they are light as a feather and can blink to take down larger-than-life foes. This is where the absolute genius of Red Dead Redemption 2's prologue chapter comes into play. An already slow game introduces you to its world with the gang on the run, tired, worn down, traveling through a blizzardy mountain pass. As Arthur, you trudge through the snow to find shelter, look for John, and rescue Sadie Adler from her homestead. All the basic elements of how you interact with the world, from combat to traversal, are already more deliberate than some other AAA games, but they're introduced to you at an even slower pace and worse feeling than normal in this intro. Walking takes forever, your horse is slower, and you can only do so much in these story-heavy first few days. By the time you enter Valentine, though, it feels like you're Goku taking his weighted clothing off after training with it. By comparison, everything feels lighter, faster, stronger, and more easily manageable as a player controlling a video game character. It's still slow in comparison to other games, but leading with this segment almost weeds out the people who aren't on board for the pace the game asks you to settle into. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game you need to settle into, and one that makes you play it on its own terms. With the landscape of AAA gaming at the time, and even today, that is a bit of a tall ask. If you manage to make it through this trial by snow and agree to play the game on its terms, I feel the following 40 plus hours of game are unrivaled in terms of immersion, narrative, character building, digital cinematography, and a laundry list of other artistic achievements. To this day, I feel like the game has yet to be dethroned in terms of storytelling, character, and its interactivity in an open world setting. It feels like a miracle that this game exists exactly the way it does, with how expensive, obtuse, and full of friction it really is. Where games like Assassin's Creed and the Horizon series can falter for me is their lack of cohesion between their systems, story, and what you're physically doing moment to moment. It all feels fairly segmented, like each part of the game had their own dedicated team that had to follow guidelines to fit the same vibe of the game, but they still feel like they exist in a way where they're a little isolated. Side activities may feed into progression by gaining XP, but the presentation and interaction feels separated from the main story or goals of your character, or how they even do things in this game. In Red Dead Redemption 2, everything feels well integrated and connected because of the way you interact with the world. I forget if Rockstar ever gave a proper noun to describe the function of L2, but I've always called it the context button. From combat to caring for your horse, looting, or talking to NPCs, every single thing you do as Arthur to engage with the open world and its logic comes from interaction options you're given when holding down the left trigger. Riding past an NPC that wants to race you is handled the same way you handle robbing someone in the open world. Finding a stranger that needs your help is seamless and handled in the same way that a gang member will ask you for help at the camp. Everything in the game is treated the same in how it's presented in relation to Arthur in the world, whether it's optional or a pivotal story moment. That goes a long way for immersion, and makes me more than happy to dedicate to my game time to an experience like this. If anything I spend time doing in the game feels like it matters as much as anything else, and my view of a scene or situation can influence what I do and how it's resolved, that's really what I'm looking for in a game experience like this. By the time you reach the back half of Red Dead Redemption 2, you're fully on board with the logic of the game, how you interact with it and its systems, and you're likely greatly invested in Arthur's character. Because the game spends so much time to make you care for this man through watching him grow, but more importantly from managing his cores in a modular way to interact with the world, the way they tie that connection and the cores into the story is one of the most satisfying narrative beats I've experienced in a AAA game in my lifetime. Arthur having tuberculosis, and that moment it's revealed, both impacts the narrative of redemption the game has been building towards, and how you will interact with the world for the remainder of the runtime. It is the ultimate payoff for a game like this. Arthur persevering through his strife to achieve redemption despite being rapidly dying is something you really feel because of the core system, rather than just see it happen in a very well acted cutscene. If the game was snappier, less committed to building this immersion, or just played like the original, this meeting of interactivity and storytelling would not nearly be as strong. You would still likely care for Arthur at that point in the game just because you've seen him on your screen for dozens of hours brought to life perfectly by Roger Clark, but it would be far less impactful emotionally, at least for me. I recognize there is a level of patience needed to get here, but that is why I think the prologue is so important to this moment being able to work. Those that will commit to the game when it's at its worst feeling will be given salvation in Valentine. Then they'll have their hearts broken thanks to their investment in the game's story and commitment to its systems. Not many other teams can attempt something like this for how polarizing and expensive it is. But Rockstar can just afford it. When you make Grand Theft Auto 5 and it's consistently a chart topper month after month after month for nearly a decade, I feel like you gain a lot of leeway creatively, and I would imagine financially. I think that shines through with Red Dead Redemption 2 existing as it does. Almost every system, detail, and decision we've talked about so far feels like it was greenlit because it was Rockstar at the helm. This big budget, immersive sim, narrative heavy cowboy game sounds like something that should just not exist. It feels like a multi-million-dollar passion project, and that's just something AAA gaming rarely sees. A lot of why I'm able to find myself invested with Red Dead Redemption 2, even with other games that focus on long narratives, expansive open worlds, or self-serious storytelling lose me these days, all traces back to the cohesion this game demonstrates. But it's clear that that level of cohesion is expensive and takes a very, very long time to achieve. And it was only possible thanks to the affordances GTA 5 specifically gave this project. Not everybody is able to make a game like this, and that's where my thesis comes into play. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a remarkable video game, one of my absolute favorites of all time, but it is not what video games should aim to be. It's just not possible for most of them, and seemingly not healthy either. Even with the constant revenue stream from GTA 5, Rockstar still reportedly had loads of intense crunch and toxicity in the development of Red Dead Redemption 2. Overworked hours are things we hear about often in games, and the reality is not every project with crunch ends up delivering something remarkable. I deeply love what Rockstar ended up delivering, but the budget and time they got because they're Rockstar is why. If all that plus crunch is what it takes, I have a hard time seeing why any game can justify aiming for that. Reportedly, a lot of these issues have been solved at the studio with the development of Grand Theft Auto 6, and that's partially why it's taken the game so long to show up. We'll have to see, but I am hopeful. If Grand Theft Auto 6 is able to be remotely as impressive of an open world, narrative, and immersive game, my feelings on the affordances of budget and time only Rockstar can have in this current industry, leading to cohesion on this level, it'll only be reaffirmed. There are a handful of other studios who seem to have a lot of freedom under their respective publishers as well, but to me, the focus just lands somewhere I'm not really interested in at this point. Do not get me wrong. There are plenty of games that don't swing for what Red Dead Redemption 2 does that I still enjoy or even love. It's just hard to feel like I'm impressed by games that only aim to be cinematic these days because it feels like the experience overall suffers for it. Despite that, there are games that I feel are able to stand out and excel in these fronts. Games like Death Stranding or Near Replicant are some where I've found the mechanics meld beautifully with the story they're telling, and they manage to take advantage of gaming as a medium for storytelling in ways a lot of other games simply don't. These titles also commit to establishing their mechanics in a way that serves the overall work, rather than aiming to serve the largest audience. It's no surprise to me that the reception of games like Death Stranding is loved or hated for the most part. Same with Nier. Something like Elden Ring is a bit of an anomaly to me, looking at all of this. Elden Ring is far more obtuse and packed to the brim with friction compared to Red Dead, but the game won Game of the Year in so many circles, sold over 25 million copies, and has inspired many, including Naughty Dog's Neil Druckmann, with its design. Is Elden Ring a fluke? Are mainstream gamers hungry for friction after such a long time of not facing much resistance in the games they've been playing? I don't really have an answer for that right now, but I hope the latter is the case. In a traditional sense at least, I still feel that Red Dead Redemption 2 is the best example of a mainstream, approachable, conventionally controlling and designed game that is able to commit to mechanics that bolster the impact of the work's narrative rather than the narrative holding the other stuff back. It seems like something that feels increasingly rare to see nailed, seemingly for good reason, but I'm at least glad it happened here. I'm by no means saying nobody should bother making open world and narrative games or cinematic linear adventures, or that they don't have a place in the industry or my library. They more than deserve that space. I just think that area of gaming is very well treaded. A AAA open world game has largely been the same since Assassin's Creed 2. And a serious narrative game has pretty much been figured out since The Last of Us. I will gladly play and adore a game like Ghost of Tsushima or Final Fantasy XVI once every few years when I'm hungry for an experience like that, but I definitely do not need a game like that as often as the release calendar provides them. My focus today is different than it was when games like this were all I wanted to play, but frankly, I think my focus and perspective on games should be different now than it was when I was 15 years old. All the same, if ever Rockstar decides to settle up for a new Red Dead, I will happily ride again. And that has been the first episode of Rantable, a new series here on Game Rant where we get personal about a game or gaming topic. If you enjoyed and would like to see more videos like this, please let us know. And if you feel similar to me, I would love to hear why some games work for you against all odds in a genre you may be tired of or not really enjoy altogether. Once again, I've been Christian, and as always, stay tuned to Game Rant.